Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Remote Leadership Strategies. My name is Tom Stallings from Thoughtworks, and I'll be your moderator today. But before we get started, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items with you. You may have noticed that your phone line or microphone has been muted. We're muting to ensure that the highest quality sound during the entire session. We also encourage you to ask questions whenever you have one by using the questions section via your Zoom webinar panel. We'll also be pausing to answer your questions throughout the conversation. Instead of doing a long Q&A session towards the end, we'll be doing several Q&A sessions. If we don't get to your question, we'll reach out to you personally after the event. Early next week, each of you will receive a video recording and some follow-up materials from today's event. And we encourage you to share with your friends and colleagues. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Rebecca Parsons, Kathy Gettelfinger, and Karen Rousey. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom.
So a little bit of a background on everyone. Rebecca is our Thoughtworks Global Chief Technology Officer and has decades of technical experience in application development across a range of industries and systems. She has led the creation of large-scale distributed object applications and the integration of disparate systems, and has co-authored the books on domain-specific languages and building evolutionary architectures. Separate from her passion for deep technology, Rebecca is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion in the technology industry and is committed to increasing the number of women in coding and STEM fields. Kathy is Thoughtworks' digital transformation executive partner and has spent over 20 years working in the world of IT and software development. Kathy specializes in bringing clarity, focus, and alignment to the people who execute strategy and helping leaders connect with their people in ways that focus on getting things done. Karen is our head of technology and strategy for Thoughtworks North America. She is the world's #1 expert on the Evolve team, as featured in Inc. magazine, Entrepreneur, Forbes, and Success. Her work as a CTO and certified coach has helped executives solve the critical problem and strategic challenges facing many companies today. Again, welcome Kathy, Rebecca, Karen, and thank you for leading today's discussion.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
So we're going to move to a little bit of a fun thing before we start today's session. And one of the things we find with many organizations is we're not in our offices anymore. We're many of them remote. So how do we kind of do something a little bit fun and unique? So what we're going to do is we're all going to move into the same room. So many of those that have used Zoom or other technologies allow you to change your virtual backgrounds. So we're going to do that all for you today to replicate what is it like if we were working in the same room today. All right.
It's a much nicer office than my office.
It definitely is more spring focused, even though here it's raining, which is definitely spring. Okay, that was fun. All right, so a little disclaimer. Let's go ahead to the remote strategies landscape. So many of you might have seen this landscape that we looked at and shared on LinkedIn and various forums of some of the things that were considered in terms of content for today's discussion. Now, here's a little bit of a disclaimer. We acknowledge that the entire remote work landscape, this all cannot be covered within 50 minutes today. And we also can't solve the entire problem. But what we are going to do today is have a great discussion. We hope that's helpful, answer your questions along the way, and provide actionable advice that you can use within your organization. So with that being said, let's dive into a little bit about what we will be focusing in more detail on. So today's content is going to be focused specifically on building shared understanding, team collaboration, and driving decisions. So as we mentioned before, we are going to pause and do polls and questions throughout this discussion to make this as interactive as we possibly can. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick audience poll, and you should be seeing a question that pops up. 2 questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, what is your level of comfort with the topics we'll be covering today? 2, do you feel adequately prepared to make the transition to remote work? We're going to give everyone about 15 seconds so we can aggregate your answers, and then we're going to share back the live results. All right. We will also be sharing the polling results and some data as part of the material that we provide and share with everyone at the beginning of next week. All right. Thank you for everyone's participation. So let's jump in. First of all, I'd like to introduce Kathy Gettelfinger, and she'll be leading our first section on building a shared understanding. Welcome, Kathy.
Thanks, Tom. One of the reasons we focused on the areas we did is because a lot of teams have a lot of the technical aspects kind of getting sorted. But what we've seen and heard from our clients is that while some delivery teams are able to continue functioning actually really well, some leadership teams are struggling. Because they're realizing how much of what they did was actually done in that space between meetings, or when they kind of bumped into people in the cafeteria or caught a coffee somewhere. And a leader's, one of their big jobs is to build bridges for their teams, between colleagues, between different departments, et cetera. And so we wanted to make sure we helped provide ideas for people to help continue to build these bridges, which will help develop shared understanding among their teams and among their colleagues. So what I wanted to talk about was 4 things that I think are important in this. One is show up. 2, be present. 3, provide clarity. And the 4th one is listen, which sounds like a really obvious thing. All these things actually sound pretty obvious, but I thought it'd be important to share some thoughts and ideas around this. As a leader, how you show up is going to set the tone for your team, obviously. So you want to be one of those people who shows up in a way that will encourage your team and your colleagues to also show up in a respectful way. What do I mean by that? I mean, having your video on is something that people are maybe not used to. And in the past, it was okay and acceptable to just kind of phone it in. But nowadays, actually, it's incredibly important that we actually turn on our video, have a good setup, and show up, literally. I think it's also really important as a leader that you create some of these virtual expectations for your team. You can do that by demonstration, but you can also do that by being very explicit about what your expectations of your people are. And another just little thing I thought I'd throw in there, I don't know if this is true for everybody, we should have had a poll on this, but I have been in back-to-back meetings so much that it's like people only use the calendar defaults for like 1 hour or 30-minute meetings. Consider, ignoring those defaults and tweaking them to maybe be 50-minute meetings. Maybe that's a new norm that you want to establish at your organization. And then being present, which is actually not the same as showing up. Because how many of you have showed up to a meeting even today or sometime this week where you were maybe like on your phone doing something, but you kind of had it hidden here and you could put on your sort of poker face so it's as though you're paying attention, but you're not quite paying attention. Being present is about eliminating all those distractions, because everyone can tell actually when you are distracted and not actually paying attention. So as a leader, you should be demonstrating that behavior and even including that in your virtual expectations. Additionally, how can you be present when you're trying to navigate this new world of technology and logistics? I think the higher the stakes are for a given meeting or a virtual event, the more important it is for you to maybe even identify someone to facilitate so that you can actually participate. I know it's true. I facilitate a lot of in-person meetings and now a lot of virtual meetings. It is really challenging to actually keep things moving along logistically and format-wise while also participating. So if you have something high stakes, be sure and find someone who doesn't have a dog in that hunt to facilitate with you. And that leads me to providing clarity. Have you been to any meetings recently where at the end you were like, I'm not really sure why I was at that meeting or what I was supposed to be doing? Or maybe in the middle, you felt that way. It's really important that people have a purpose for the meeting. And this also sounds very basic, sending out that agenda in advance becomes doubly important when you're virtual. But also maybe helping your people understand, what role am I playing in this meeting? How do you want me to participate? Am I watching and listening, or am I actively providing ideas or helping make decisions? It seems really simple, but providing that kind of clarity and calling out the expected outcomes and expectations will actually encourage and help everyone be able to participate more fully. You can even establish some of these sort of shared operating agreements with people, especially if it's a team you're meeting with regularly. You might need to revisit operating agreements that you assumed were a given. They may not so much be a given anymore. And then the other thing I wanted to call out, which is important in building bridges and helping create shared understanding, is listen. I called it listen, but it's not about being passively listening. It's more about creating space for those voices that you maybe would only get an opportunity to hear through those incidental interactions throughout the day. Drive-bys, you know, those desk drive-bys where your boss comes by and you get to quickly catch up and let them know things that are going on aren't happening. So how can you make sure that you're creating opportunities to truly listen to people? I think Kieran and Rebecca are both going to be talking about like really good processes that you can use. And I recommend that you use those processes and repeat them so people can get comfortable with it. But I especially want to call out that making space for the voices to be heard on these virtual interactions is really important. And a couple of really good techniques for that. One is something called round robin. And I learned this from the Center for Purposeful Leadership and the way they do their virtual meetings, where you can put in the chat everybody's name in an order with a particular question or open idea. Ask everybody to answer that question in order, and this is a time when it's appropriate to use your phone. You can actually time them, give everybody 1 or 2 minutes, and go around. That way you've gotten the opportunity, everyone has had the opportunity to be heard. And then also breakout sessions, which I'm sure Kieran will probably be discussing more, but all these opportunities to change up and have, you know, 2 or 3 people interactions versus just the 10 or 12 interactions are really important to continue to intentionally create. And one last idea on listening. Consider maybe making open office hours on your calendar a regular thing, kind of like the old college professor thing. And people could make, you know, 15-minute slots during that space so that you can just catch up and have a chance to have a virtual coffee together, or in the evening, could make it something else. I don't know. Hopefully you're not working too late into the evening, but just create space for those opportunities for your people to be seen and heard. And it will really help you as you're trying to establish relationships and build better relationships for shared understanding. So.
Thank you, Kathy. We'll take a minute here or two, or Rebecca and or Kieran, do either of you have want to layer on a thought or comment on top of what Kathy shared?
No, Kathy, I mean, I think you raised a lot of really kind of great points about, you know, bridging this gap. You know, leading in a remote setting is just different, right, than when we're face to face, and it takes a level of intentionality, I think, to create the kind of experiences that you want, which I've seen you in action and you're quite masterful at. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we get a lot more out of those informal reactions and informal interactions than I think we realize. And being able to bridge those gaps, to be able to understand really where people are. And I think, I also think we underestimate the extent to which this medium, sure, it feels like we're all in the same room, but I can't really see your body language in the same way. And I can't read those expressions in quite the same way. And we definitely need to be much more intentional about checking in with people and finding out where they are and what hurdles that they have, because those informal cues just aren't there anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe the key word I left out was intentional. You're going to have to craft experiences to really get that relationship building happening.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick pause here. What we're going to do is source out questions from the audience, and we're going to take about 5 minutes to go through some of those answers. And then we'll also show and share several of the key takeaways that Kathy has walked through as an overview. So right now we'll so everyone will be receiving this information and all the materials early next week, but feel free to take a screenshot as we all normally do. But But what we're else going to do right now is we'll take and look for our first questions that kind of come up, and then we'll answer a handful of those accordingly.
I'd love to hear too, if people don't have a question, but if they have another idea for creating those incidental, accidental interactions, I think that sharing those right now is a really great benefit for everyone.
Yeah, I think as we're waiting here, Rebecca, you bring a good point. We don't have that social interaction. And I was on a call with a colleague yesterday, and it wasn't video, but there was something a little off. I could tell it was a different conversation. So I had to ask, and I think there's an aspect of now more than ever doing more active listening, whether you are on video or in conversations, to really be intentional. I think the intentional communication is a really big key takeaway that I'm taking from this.
I think another part of that, Tom, you raise a good point, and it's asking clarifying questions, right? Being more curious, and to Kathy's point about active listening, it's part of that same thread. We need to be more conscious around the kinds of questions that we're asking to build shared understanding, to get alignment, and to co-create our experience in this world.
Well,
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we underestimate what happens during breaks. I recently did, a 4-day, 6-hour-a-day meeting with lots of breaks. And when you're in person during those long meetings, when you take a coffee break, people go to the coffee machine together and they congregate at the snacks table. When everybody is in their own house, everybody goes to their own kitchen to get their cup of tea or coffee. And then you don't have those informal interactions anymore, and those, hey, I didn't really understand what you were talking about there. Could you clarify? And we just miss those. And until you really stop and think about what are all of the ways that groups come to these shared understandings, and then what do we have to do to replicate that style of interaction in a virtual environment?
So
yeah.
So a couple of pieces that have just come up. Got a question here, and I want to make a comment back. I think that there's some feedback here of, can we speak to helping understand how people contribute, and expectations and invitations? I think there's also, and why does that matter? I also think there's a comment here, panelists, of how do you keep the audience involved? Also, one that was here was really interesting, not having one-way conversations.
Yeah.
I think that's, there's two aspects of that, the person speaking and then the person listening. How often are we thinking of the next thing we want to say when the other person's talking?
Yeah, I have seen a lot that pontificating, or maybe soliloquizing, I don't know if that's a word, but you've seen that it's hard to find a way to jump in and participate in the conversation, and that's where process is really important, and being clear about the process for people, and even repeating the process. And both Kieran and Rebecca have some good process ideas they're going to be touching on. I think the more you start repeating these techniques and processes, the more people will get comfortable with it, and the more you change up the opportunities to speak for introverts, for extroverts.
Yeah.
You kind of have to meet a lot of audiences for that.
So let's jump into QA right now. We actually have a question here. Says, on Monday, I will start a new job as a project manager and will work completely remotely for at least 2 months. Any advice for integrating into a team and networking within the company? Maybe as this is a topic area led by Kathy, we start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think that would be a scary and interesting thing to be doing, right? I'm used to, when I start a gig, I'm working with people directly face to face. So how do you build those relationships? I do think one-on-one chats, short ones, would be good. With a team, it actually could be interesting to do some speed networking, getting everyone together and then doing some breakouts, facilitated sort of speed networking with them. Even maybe who I am presentations, which I've done with teams in person before. They could easily be done online. And I would throw out one other thing. Last week, I had the pleasure of playing bingo with a team in the evening. And Tom's smiling because he invited me and he regretted it because I won 2 of the games. But And it was one of the folks on the team just very cleverly set up technology that made it a really amazing experience. And it was so much fun. And I felt it was the most connected I've felt to people in several weeks, actually. So doing things like that and playing games together is a great idea as well.
That's a good point. We're intentionally trying to do that every couple of weeks and inviting as many people as we can and mixing up it a little bit. So there are social aspects of work. And when you take that away and you're not physically interacting with people, how do you try to replicate that social piece?
Sure. I think, one thing I would add is with everybody that you're introduced to at this new company, ask, who should I connect with next, right? To help expand your network. I love the ideas of, doing the one-on-ones and an opportunity for them to get to know you and for you to get to know them. Another idea is just to do some pairing, right? Somebody that you get to know that's in your same space. See if you can kind of tag along for a day to their meetings and to other activities that they're doing and learn that way.
And I would just toss in, try to find some ways to make the one-on-ones informal. Because if you think about when you show up to a new job site, very often, oh, let's go for coffee. And there's just something about sitting down in a more relaxed environment that helps get that more personal connection as opposed to just the more clinical official connection. Oh, this is my role in the organization, da, 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 da. But, oh yeah, do you have any kids? That kind of thing. And so try to make space for those more informal interactions as well as just figuring out.
So a comment that just came up here is, would our recommendations be the same if that individual is the only remote employee?
Yeah, possibly. We deal with before now actually being distributed or having some people remote. There's actually something nice to everybody being remote versus just a few people being remote. It's pretty hard to be the only remote person. I do think that as the remote person, the only remote person, you are probably in a position you're going to have to make more of the intentional things happen because people will kind of forget about you sometimes. So it's going to take a lot of extra effort, but I would still probably try to do the same things. I've been on teams where we've said, well, since some people are remote, let's all do this meeting remote so that we can have the same experience for everyone. And actually it worked out really well, even though some of us were in the same building.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for submitting the questions. Again, many of the questions you're asking today, we're going to aggregate answers and thoughts, and we'll be building these into the key takeaway slides. We wanted to, one, make this interactive, share some content, two, answer a lot of your questions that you had today, and three, make sure you had some actionable advice. So let's go ahead and we'll move on to the next piece. Now, before we get started into the next section, we're going to do another quick audience poll. So has the transition to remote work made you feel closer or more isolated from your team? And I think several of the questions that were just asked were pretty good and indicative of this type of question, but it'd be really interesting to get everyone's feedback. Again, we'll wait about 15 seconds so we can aggregate the answers and share back the live results.
I'll be super curious. I have kind of heard that, some introverts actually for them, everybody being remote has maybe improved their experience. I kind of read that somewhere and I thought, oh, that's a perspective I hadn't really thought about. But if being in the office is overwhelming, being in your own space maybe actually is better for you.
I think it also goes back to, this concept of intentionality, right? Like right now we have to be very intentional about creating opportunities to connect. And whether you're introverted or extroverted, it's a new way of working.
Yeah, and it looks like more isolated is a little bit edging out closer. I spoke with an executive a couple of weeks ago, and it's interesting. Yeah, one of the developers had been there for 15 years, and moving remote was very isolating. And there's the social point you brought up, integrated with the team, doesn't have a family. It doesn't have something that the remote circumstances kind of allow them to do. So here are the results in terms of, we feel that 56% of everyone that's answered feel a little bit more isolated. So let's transition into our next piece here. First, I'd like to introduce again Kieran, and she'll be leading our next section on team collaboration. So we'll take about 10 minutes to kind of give an overview of that. And then we're going to also dive into the questions on that topic area as well. So I'll give it over to Kieran.
Well, Tom, there's no question that team disengagement during a period of crisis or sudden transition to new ways of working can definitely impact an organization's short-term viability. The good news, though, is that leaders who do support their teams to be engaged, enabled, and energized tend to exceed organizational performance standards and can drive 3 times the operating profit margin. So the strategies that I'll go through with you guys today will help you be better equipped to kind of identify key drivers to leverage. I think broad strokes, it's important that leaders really understand that working collaboratively remotely, as Kathy had mentioned before, is different. And to sustain or boost performance requires the development of a new mindset, frankly. New social norms, new ways of working, new operational approaches, and new communication norms. I think it also requires a different level of awareness, and we talked about this before, intentionality, and consciousness for the kinds of experiences that you want to create for your teams. So as we go through what it takes to kind of create that level of cohesion and trust, consider all of the ways that your team collaborates, right? Each encounter that you have with your team, Rebecca had some great thoughts about sort of what happens before the meeting and at the water cooler. So with each encounter that you are now having with your team remotely, ask yourself, are my actions, behaviors, and kind of who I'm choosing to show up as and the experiences that I'm trying to create, is that bringing me closer to the experience I want to have with my team, or is that moving me farther away? Okay, so the first area I'll touch on is something that'll help you sort of promote team collaboration, buy-in, and like I mentioned before, this kind of bi-directional trust, which I think has shifted in a remote setting, especially for leaders that are not used to managing people remotely. And the first thing is co-creating what good looks like, right? So defining a remote work model that makes newcomers, which is a great question, glad we got that question, that makes newcomers feel just as supported and as connected to your team as somebody who came before this transition, right? Focusing on outcomes and making sure that it aligns to your organization's culture and your team's value system, I think is important. So for those of us who are spinning up new teams during this period of time, again, making sure that you're building an inclusive culture from the start, right? So that remote people don't feel like second-class citizens, and considering, you know, again, like what is worth keeping from this transition, right? Are there things that we're experiencing now that actually makes sense to integrate into our day-to-day practices should we go back to being in person, right? So if you're spinning up a new team, I'd also recommend that you focus on icebreakers that are about getting to know each other, understanding each other's strengths, weaknesses, work styles. I made this recommendation earlier about, you know, virtual co-working or pairing. We do a lot of that in our company. But also consider doing virtual lunch and learns, happy hour, or maybe even game night. Bingo sounded fun. I missed that. I'm disappointed I did. But you also may need to kind of rethink your approach to onboarding and offboarding. Yeah, so the next topic I'll cover is something that I think will help you sort of avoid miscommunication, misalignment, misunderstandings, things like that, which I would say are generally amplified in a remote setting if you don't have that sort of level of intentionality that we talked about. So Kathy touched on this in her section, but it's really about striving for clarity and establishing these new social and communication norms. So define your rules of engagement and co-create that with your team, right? So set clear expectations for team collaboration, meeting participation, and communication. Tom, I mentioned earlier, you know, about asking clear and focused questions. This is a time to really practice those skills. Asking questions instead of making assumptions, especially in a remote context, will help you stay aligned with your team. Rebecca's got some great tips about and strategies for how to drive decision-making, which is also a critical part of, you know, maintaining sort of team hygiene. But I can't tell you how many teams that I've coached and worked with over the decades where a lack of alignment has been an impediment to delivering business value or the outcomes that you want. So I will give you this tip as well. And this might actually help you in your personal life too, which is there are times when it's more important to be aligned than it is to be right. And that means setting aside personal agendas, setting aside egos, to do what's in the best interest of the success of the team. So some sample activities that you might want to consider. Kathy touched on this. It's sort of your overall operating agreement. I like to call it ways of working. And this is something you can co-create with your team that will help them put together a list of things that they need to be successful. It's a way to hold each other accountable for the behaviors and the actions that are needed for success. The other thing is, leaders, I would recommend that you do is create opportunities for regular team check-ins, right? Like, what's working? What isn't working? A very simple activity you could do around this is, what should we start, stop, and continue? Or for those in more of a technical field, holding a retrospective, right? Voting on the most pressing issues based on what's working, what isn't, and what might need to change, right? Okay, so you're aligned on expectations. What do you do now? Focus on results and outcomes, not on time spent. I've been hearing a lot from my friends and colleagues about, you know, status reports and work logs and everything to prove that they're doing the work because they're doing it from home instead of in the office. I highly recommend, to improve that bidirectional trust, is to really focus on outcomes for your programs or your project management. So resisting the urge to micromanage or show proof of the work being done, but also create an opportunity to give additional support to those who are not used to working as autonomously. So once you're in a groove, right? You're in a groove of working from home, but the lines are starting to blur. We were talking about this earlier. I don't even know the difference between personal time and work time. I'm compelled to answer my phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. What do you do then? This is about setting healthy boundaries while making sure that you're available during whatever you define as your work hour. So leaders, help your team position them so that they don't feel obligated to be accessible 24 hours a day. Define windows of overlap and availability of both you as the leader and your team members to accommodate different time zones and work hour differences. And the last couple are really about creating this opportunity for connection, right? Invest in team building activity. Create virtual spaces, rituals, celebrations, socializing, problem solving, and collaboration opportunities. We talked a lot about how to sort of recreate these sort of impromptu encounters that we used to have. I've been at companies where we have Slack channels in which we use an automation tool that will help pair people in the organization to have virtual coffee to just get to know each other. We've also created channels that allow you to get feedback, ask for help, you know, get questions answered, things of that nature. So think creatively about how to kind of recreate those impromptu encounters. And I think for leaders, it's particularly important to realize that the opportunity for people to get positive feedback about their work that you used to say as you were walking by somebody's desk is now gone. So, you know, find ways to recreate that as well. And on the topic of recreating, don't recreate the room. In-person brainstorming, problem solving, collaboration activities, all of those things will likely have to be augmented for a remote setting. So think about the outcomes you want to achieve and then design your working sessions or your collaborative working sessions to deliver those outcomes, and use tools and practices that support that. Kathy mentioned the use of breakout rooms in Zoom. Similarly, if you need to drive decision-making, you can use Zoom polling, voting, and things of that nature. I like to use another technique, the rabbit and the volcano card. These can be great if you want to prevent somebody from going down a rabbit hole. Everybody gets to draw a rabbit, and as the conversation starts going off track, you hold up the rabbit card to help get people back on track. Likewise, with the volcano card, this gives somebody with the opportunity, if you're talking about representing equal voices, the opportunity to say, listen, there's something I need to get off my chest. I need a safe space to do it. I get 60 seconds to air my grievance in the safety of my team's remote setting, and let them go at it. So the only other thing I wanted to cover was basically the concept of unlearning and adapting, right? So this is about kind of rethinking strategies, retooling your capabilities, and encouraging you not to rely on sort of outdated thinking and past successes or practices that don't work in the remote world. Get creative, have fun with it, keep checking in with your teams. Now I'll turn it back over to Tom.
So a couple of really interesting questions, and Kieran, this is a great topic. And some of the questions, you'll see us answer some of these offline direct texts and reference to other materials, and some of these we'll pull into asking the Q&A, but here's an interesting one. Can you speak to creating alignment with multi-generational teams that have conflicting relationships with technology?
That's a great question. So what I like to do with either multi-generational teams, perhaps ethnically or culturally diverse teams, or even distributed teams, is almost like conflict resolution, right? Find the one thing that we can agree on, right? So, and align to the thing that you can agree on. And it's going to be a give and take, right? Everybody's going to have to compromise in some way.
Yeah.
But if you can get the team to agree that these are the outcomes that are most important for our success, to deliver to our clients, to, deliver on our mission, and things like that, I would start to try to develop some consensus and alignment around the purpose of you guys existing, right, as a team, and start there. Because if you're just going to look at it in terms of focusing on the difference, it's going to be really difficult to sort of bring people together, whether or not they're technically challenged or not.
So next question, some of it is actually highlighted in key takeaways, but with so many people working from home in environments not designed for work, are there changes to expectations and etiquette you might suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And this has to do with co-creating the kind of new social and communication norms, and why I say it's really important to be intentional. It's tempting to work in your pajamas all day, right? Tom, you as a salesperson, generally when you meet with clients, I assume, probably not in your pajamas. So this was the first time in a while I've thrown on a dress shirt, done my hair, and put makeup on, okay? But there are times where, in the absence of structure and routine, we have to be diligent about creating it for ourselves. So dressing for success, distraction clearing, matching, the message to the channel, like I said, all of those are ways that you can sort of create what the new normal or the next normal looks like.
That's great. Another quick question here before we kind of move on sections is, can you give some examples of icebreakers that can be done virtually?
Yes. Okay. I love this one. Okay. So for teams that have been working together, right? Already established teams,
yep.
And you can look this one up online. There's an icebreaker that I use with a lot of leadership teams, and that is Lost at Sea. And it's an individual assessment that people go through on their own, and then they do it as a team, and they look at the differences between how did I perform as an individual versus what was the outcome when we tried to work together. The other sort of icebreaker activities that you could do with a team that you're just spinning up are more around getting to know each other, right? It's icebreakers that are based on strengths, weaknesses. There's kind of a sillier one, right, which is 2 lies and a truth, where people get to learn fun facts about their colleagues. So there's a lot of different ways to play it. Again, with the icebreakers, I would still encourage you to think, what are the outcomes that I want my team to have by the end of this? Is it shared understanding? Is it learning how to work together more effectively? Is it learning about each other? And then pick an icebreaker that's kind of suitable for that purpose.
Okay. I think we have a minute or so here. Rebecca or Kathy, did you guys want to layer on any other thoughts?
Well, one fun icebreaker, Kieran, that we did on a call we were facilitating together was a would you rather. I thought that was a fun one. It was a safe for work version, but you asked everyone, we kind of incorporated the round robin so we could hear everyone's voice, and then asked, okay, say your name, where you're located, and would you rather be a refrigerator or a stove, and why? And it was It was sounded very silly, but I think it was actually it was a really interesting, very short icebreaker as compared to sort of Lost at Sea.
I think I'm going to go with refrigerator on that one.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you get to learn sort of the subtleties of how your team thinks and makes decisions or even presents themselves, right?
Yeah, and one that I think takes on a new twist when everybody is working from home and has access to the internet is where people pick 2 or 3 pictures that reflect how they feel about a particular topic or how they feel about their situation. And when I've done it face to face, people just lay the photographs out. Whereas in this setting, if people have a little prep, they can just do a Google search on, what are the things that most represent. And I think that's a nice way to get to know some different things about people.
Okay.
Yeah, we did one recently where, because we're sort of all on lockdown, if you could travel anywhere in the world right now, choose a virtual background that represents, where you'd be, or show off your hometown or your favorite TV show, things like that.
There's definitely been a lot of fun with virtual backgrounds. I think there's a whole other webinar we can organize on virtual backgrounds. So let's move on to the next section. Before we move into Rebecca's piece on driving decisions, we're going to do another quick audience poll. So since we started working remotely, how many decisions that you thought had been made were not actually successfully agreed to and executed? So again, we'll give everyone about 15 seconds or so, and then we will share the results.
Is that an exclusively remote problem?
No, but it's a different.
Yeah, really.
It's a different
No, it
one.
is different.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we've been talking about that definitely do not apply to the virtual remote world. But I do think that the lessons learned out of this as we prepare for the new normal will help as we integrate back into working more face-to-face.
So interesting.
Mm-hmm.
More people at 0 than I would have expected. Lucky you all.
So as we go through the poll, please submit some of your questions as you're thinking about the different topic areas. Again, some of these we'll be addressing and answering offline, and some of these will take some time to answer after Rebecca's section. So I'd like to introduce again Rebecca, who will be leading our last section on driving decisions.
And many of the techniques that we've talked about in the previous 2 sessions actually apply for making decisions, but I want to focus in on the actual decision making itself. And remind people first that all of that work you used to do pre-meeting is also just as important. Are there people within the decision-making group that you really don't want to blindside with this particular decision? Do whatever you have to do to pre-socialize that with them so that they understand what's coming. If you know there are particular individuals that, sure, I know how to handle that one, face to face, but it's more difficult sometimes to handle a contrary voice in a video conference setting. So this pre-socialization of your ideas is just as important, if not more important, once you're trying to move a team to decision-making in a virtual setting. And this is true even if the team has been working together a long time, you're used to the dynamics, but don't underestimate that need to do that pre-work. Similarly, make sure that you set the expectations that this is a decision-making meeting. One of the things that we have found very helpful, our global management team has been working virtually for literally years because we're scattered across the globe. And we make sure on the agenda items, is this just an update? Is this for feedback and discussion, or is this a decision? Be very explicit if you're seeking a decision, because conversations will very often go differently. If somebody thinks you're just asking for feedback, they might say, okay, I'll address this later. But if it's actually a decision, they need to know that so that they can react accordingly. And again, you won't be able to tell that discomfort necessarily on a video conference. And also you should be explicit about what the criteria is for the decision. On what basis? What are the things that we're going to prioritize? Make that space for the discussion of the trade-offs. Very few decisions that matter are clear-cut. Yes, everybody agrees coming in, we need 2 minutes to frame the question and then we're done. The interesting decisions are the ones where there isn't a clear answer. And sometimes being more explicit about discussing the criteria that you're using for your particular decision and allowing space for others to say, well, actually, this is how I see the trade-offs, can bring you to better resolution. This is particularly important if you are looking more for consensus decisions as opposed to a group norm of voting. If you have those ways of working, as we've been talking about, that say, we're going to take a vote and the majority wins, and then we make sure everybody who lost understands enough about the rationale that when everybody leaves the room, they support the decision. Those are sometimes easier to handle because it's very clear. Okay, there were 12 votes versus 3 votes. So let's talk to the 3 to make sure that they feel like they can support the decision once you walk out of the room. It's much harder when you're trying to reach consensus because, again, you don't necessarily have those same kind of cues of how people are feeling. And so there are several techniques. One of the ones I enjoy in particular, and hopefully this comes out all right in the virtual background, is called the fist of 5. The thumb up, nope, not very happy at all. All 5, completely aligned. 3, I'm okay with where the group is. But part of why I like the fist of 5 as opposed to thumb up, thumb down, mediocre, is the power of the 2 and the 4. 2 says, yeah, I can probably get there, but I've got some real concerns. And 4 says, I might have a little niggle on the side, but this gives you very good information about where people's heads are at on the particular decision. And that's particularly important when you're trying to drive to a consensus decision. And this then brings me to the final point around actually calling the vote. We want to make sure that everybody actively votes. A head nod might be fine in an informal feedback, but we want people to be explicit. How many people vote yes? How many people vote no? And no one is, you can probably do an abstention, but you probably want to understand why someone is abstaining from a particular vote. You want these to be active votes so that you really do know where people stand. You want to allow everybody to express the full range of their opinions before the vote. So the strategies that Kathy talked about around how to make sure people have a voice, the round robin, making sure you hear from everybody and everybody has room to speak. What you don't want, and this is often what derails virtual decisions, is you've got someone who kind of lurks in the corner and maybe says something every once in a while, but really doesn't say much. And they're completely disengaged and they're completely uninvolved in the decision. And now all of a sudden, they have to go out and promote a decision that they're not really happy with. And it's sometimes in a virtual setting, it's a whole lot easier to fly below the radar. And that's, again, Kathy's suggestion. If you have a particularly tricky meeting, having someone whose role is the facilitator can help that. Because as a leader, you don't want to be seen as above the discussion or not engaged in the trade-off discussions of the decision your team is trying to make. And in a situation like that, it's very difficult to also be the one who's responsible for, oh, gee, Tom hasn't said anything in a while. I'm getting worried about that because Tom always says what he wants, what he feels. And so if he's not saying anything, that's important. If I need to be engaged in the discussion and active in the decision, I can't also be keeping track of everybody on the call. And so having a facilitator for some of those critical decisions is important.
Goes back to the interesting point of that one-way conversation. In driving decisions, it can't be a one-way conversation. And maybe that's a self-analysis. If you feel like you're having a one-way conversation, you're really not going to be driving to a group decision.
Or conversely, if I'm spending too much time facilitating the meeting, I'm not an active part of the decision. And then people might feel, okay, well, she's just pushing the responsibility down on us. She's not really bought into the decision. And that's almost more of a risk. And then finally, be very explicit about what your next steps are. How are these decisions going to be communicated? What are the specific actions in terms of potentially people who need to be brought up to speed early on the decision? Who is going to actually start the process of actioning whatever the decision is? Who is responsible for pushing the decision forward? Again, we want to be clear that when everybody leaves that virtual room, they know what decision was made, why that was the way the decision went, and what their responsibility is for actioning the decision. Because again, you can't follow someone back to their office once the Zoom conference ends. And those other strategies that we use in the face-to-face just doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Everyone's talked about, we no longer have hallway meetings without hallways. So let's jump into the questions. Interesting topic, kind of crosses all the areas. And I know that Kieran's already raised her hand to do an answer on this one, so you guys can fight on this question. But a little bit of the key takeaways in terms of Rebecca's piece and driving decisions. But a question just popped up is, so something worth the group to ponder. Swearing has been shown to build morale. And but not swearing as abuse, more swearing in means of frustration or bewilderment. And in the new norm, however, swearing in even one-on-one meetings is forbidden. The words may land on unsuspecting eardrums of family members, including children. So it's an interesting topic because I think we've all had some type of an interruption in meetings over the past couple of months, whether it's family or pets or other things. But this is an interesting topic. And so I know Kieran wanted to layer in on this.
Thanks, Tom. I think this kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier in terms of developing new social norms, right? And acting with positive intent. And in general, just having more empathy for the fact that, you know, we're having to be really creative about our workspaces right now. I was in a meeting with Tom earlier this week and he got a delivery of cookie dough, right? And a visit from his kids. And I think, you know, some of us don't have the luxury of having a separate workspace from our spouses, our kids, or our pets. And, you know, the biggest question is, when do we need to give our full sort of undivided attention to our team? And when is it okay to sort of have foot traffic in a common space? Yeah. So I recommend, just like we talk about kind of ways of working with the team, is to have that same type of conversation with your family. Come up with a way that works for both of you or all of you to sort of survive in this new normal when you're working from the home. You know, decide what works for you. And then also at the head of a meeting, feel safe and comfortable to say what your needs are. Hey, listen, you know, my kids are going to be coming in, or I'm not in a space by myself, so can we limit or keep it clean, right? Likewise, if you're going to, you know, engage in like a virtual happy hour or something to that effect, can you watch the kids while I go do this? It's all about communication. And in this time, I feel like it's important to be overly communicative, not just with your team, but with your families, to make sure that you all have sort of a positive experience in this.
So does that mean that NSF or what is it? Not safe for work becomes not safe for home, or something? Has to switch the
just something like that. Yeah.
Still work. I think Rebecca, I think you wanted to layer on.
Yeah, I think also it's trying to analyze why can swearing be effective in that context, and what are some of the other strategies? Kieran had her volcano, and actually when she first mentioned the volcano, I kind of thought of that as, oh, this is my way of saying I'm really angry right now. On one of the meetings that I just did, different people drew different things on different colored cards to indicate different things. I find this amusing, or, you know, with the hands out like this to basically say, you know, no, I'm angry. But figure out norms and ways of working that allow the different participants to express things that they might have expressed with an expletive before.
One other question we just got here before we kind of go into closing is, what if good decision is overruled by a larger audience who are together for a long time, and I like this, and act in cartel? How do you overcome something like this? And we may not be able to answer that in 90 seconds.
Yeah, well, I would say I'm not sure how different that is from any kind of even offline decision, but it does pay to know your audience and understand from the decision-making group whose responsibility is it to get the different cartel groups on board. And, you know, it may be that given sufficient feedback from, you know, stakeholder groups who maybe didn't agree with the trade-offs and such, we might have to do something different. But that's why I do think it's important in that final stage of the decisioning meeting of agreeing who has responsibility to talk to which groups that may be impacted by this decision. So at least you know it's happening, and you understand who is it that is going to at least initially take on that cartel.
Okay. So why don't we kind of move towards the ending here. We're going to do one more audience poll here quick. And as you look at the landscape again, in what area of the transition to remote work do you have the most urgent need for help? So if you think about these 6 different areas, the polling question, we're asking you just to kind of fill in which of these topical areas do you find that it is most interesting, or an area of opportunity or discussion for you internally? We'll give everyone about 15 seconds or so, and then we'll kind of share the results, feedback back. Part of also why we're doing this, as we said early on, we can't cover everything. We've covered building shared understanding, team collaboration, and driving decisions. So we do want your feedback on what are other topical areas that we'd like to be able to maybe coordinate another webinar to dive into in detail. So this is a great question for us to help guide that content. All right, so as we're kind of going through that, let's go. So here we go, the results: leadership and team development and supporting your people. Thank you. So.
Not surprised by that.
I'm actually heartened that that's something people are caring about.
I am too. That's really, really great.
So let's close out our conversation here today. And so a little bit about, so how can we help your organization? So while Thoughtworks is still helping a lot of organizations do transition to more modern digital businesses, over the past 2-3 months, there are certain areas that we've been asked to help organizations in this transition. And some of those are what we call the rapid execution activation, or REACT. And Kathy's been helping lead in those areas. We're doing a lot of digital triage of certain areas and diving into technical assessments. We're doing a lot of remote agile coaching. And I think that helping people improve those skills in a remote fashion, there's a remote playbook that we published. And then now you're looking at how do you do agile delivery in a remote fashion, and even agile planning. And then there's a lot of strategic and advisory support we've been supporting to many organizations. So if you have questions or would like to know more, you can see over on the right there. Please go to our website in the Contact Us area. If you're a current client, please reach out to your Thoughtworks team. Or also, everyone will receive today's recording, the follow-up material, and some of the aggregated answers to questions. We'll be sending that out early next week. We'll also be sending out, as part of that, a post-event survey asking you what other topics that we can dive into in a future remote landscape session would you like to hear more about. So as we close this out, I'd like to thank my colleagues, our panelists, for joining today. And from all of us at Thoughtworks, take care and be well.